They say humans are just another species in the galaxy, soft, weak creatures who stumbled into space by accident. They say human warriors break easily under pressure, that their primitive weapons and tactics are no match for advanced alien military might. They say humans cry, flee, and surrender when faced with true galactic warfare. I am General Thex Aaron of the Chronic Empire, veteran of 47 planetary campaigns, conqueror of 12 star systems. I commanded fleets that turned entire worlds to glass. I have seen species extinct themselves rather than face my armies. But I have never seen anything like what humans call war. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is why the Chronic High Command refuses to speak my name, why they've buried my reports, why they've tried to silence the only general who survived direct combat with human forces. Because the truth about humans isn't weakness, it's something far more terrifying. The truth is that when humans decide to fight, they don't just wage war. They become war itself. Listen carefully. Your survival may depend on it. General Thex Aaron stood before the massive viewing screen in his private chambers, watching the stars drift past as his ship traveled through the void toward the Galactic Military Tribunal. His forearms moved restlessly across his scaled hide, a nervous habit he'd developed since the incident at Kepler 442b. The planet humans had called New Eden. The very name should have been a warning. 3 months had passed since the battle that ended his military career. 3 months since the High Command had declared him unfit for duty due to psychological trauma and unreliable testimony regarding enemy capabilities. They wanted him to stay quiet, to accept his forced retirement gracefully, to let the official reports stand unchallenged. But Thex Aaron had seen too much to remain silent. The galaxy needed to know what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their breaking point. He activated his personal recording device, its blue glow casting strange shadows across his angular features. This would be his final testimony, broadcast to every major news network in chronic space before the tribunal could silence him forever. I am General Thex Aaron, service number 847 Gamma Prime, commanding officer of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet of the Chronic Empire, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his secondary hands. What I am about to tell you contradicts everything our military intelligence believes about the species known as humans. Everything our scientists have concluded about their psychological limitations. Everything our leaders have told us about our inevitable victory in this conflict. The recording device hummed softly as it captured every word, every inflection. Thex Aaron knew that once he transmitted this message, there would be no going back. The High Command would likely charge him with treason, sedition, or worse. But the alternative, allowing the Empire to continue its disastrous campaign against humanity based on false assumptions, would lead to far greater consequences. 6 months ago, I received orders to lead a preemptive strike against the human colony of New Eden. Intelligence reports indicated a population of approximately 50,000 civilians, with minimal military presence. The planet served primarily as an agricultural hub, providing food supplies to several nearby human settlements. By all accounts, it should have been a simple operation, a demonstration of chronic superiority that would convince the humans to surrender their territorial claims in the Outer Rim. Thex Aaron paused, closing his eyes as memories flooded back. The initial confidence of his officers, the casual dismissal of human military capabilities during the pre-battle briefings, the absolute certainty that victory would come swiftly and decisively. Our intelligence was both accurate and completely wrong, he continued. New Eden did have 50,000 civilians. It did serve as an agricultural center. And it did have minimal military presence. Exactly 47 human soldiers assigned to planetary defense duties. What our intelligence failed to understand was that these distinctions, civilian, military, combatant, non-combatant, have no meaning to humans when their homes are threatened. The general moved to his desk, retrieving a datapad filled with casualty reports and tactical analyses. The numbers still seemed impossible, even after months of review and verification. My fleet consisted of 3 heavy cruisers, 12 destroyer-class vessels, and 48 fighter squadrons. Our ground forces included 8,000 elite shock troopers, supported by armored vehicles and aerial bombardment units. We outnumbered the human defenders by more than 100 to 1. Our technology was superior in every measurable category. We had orbital supremacy, air superiority, and overwhelming firepower advantage. He set down the data pad, his primary hands clenching into fists as he remembered the confidence, the arrogance, with which he had approached the battle. The initial assault proceeded exactly as planned. Our orbital bombardment neutralized the humans' primary defensive installations within the first hour. Our fighter squadrons achieved complete air superiority within 3 hours. Our shock troopers established beachheads at 6 strategic landing zones without encountering significant resistance. By all tactical assessments, the battle was over before it truly began. Thexarin activated a holographic display showing the planet's surface, marking the various combat zones with pulsing red indicators. Each dot represented a site of engagement, and there were far more dots than any reasonable military analysis would have predicted. What happened next defied every principle of conventional warfare I had studied in my 3 decades of military service. The humans didn't retreat to fortified positions. They didn't attempt to negotiate surrender terms. They didn't even follow basic tactical doctrine for asymmetric warfare. The general's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued. They became ghosts. They became shadows. They became the very landscape itself rising up to destroy us. The first indication that something was wrong had come 6 hours into the ground assault. Thexarin's forces had secured their landing zones and begun advancing toward the primary population centers, following standard occupation procedures. The plan called for swift movement to capture key infrastructure while minimizing civilian casualties, partly for propaganda purposes, partly to preserve the planet's economic value. Lieutenant Commander Vexhai was leading the Northern Assault Column when he reported unusual activity. Thexarin explained, his secondary hands manipulating the holographic display to show troop movements. His sensors were detecting movement in the forests ahead of his position, but visual confirmation was impossible. The humans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first attack had been brutally simple. A massive tree, carefully weakened and rigged with explosive charges, had crashed down across the narrow mountain pass, where Vexhai's column was advancing. The timing was perfect. The tree fell just as the lead vehicles entered the most constricted part of the pass, creating a bottleneck that trapped the entire column. Before my forces could react, the humans struck from every direction at once, not with advanced weapons or sophisticated technology, but with tools they had improvised from their own agricultural equipment. Fertilizer bombs, hunting rifles modified for armor penetration, farming vehicles converted into mobile weapons platforms. Thexarin paused, remembering the confusion in the initial reports. His officers had struggled to understand how a civilian population could mount such an effective ambush with what amounted to farming tools and household chemicals. We lost 36 vehicles and nearly 200 troops in the first 15 minutes of that engagement. But that wasn't the most disturbing aspect of the attack. What truly shook my commanders was the humans' absolute disregard for their own safety. They charged armored vehicles with nothing but improvised explosives. They engaged our troops in hand-to-hand combat, even when vastly outnumbered. They fought as if death was preferable to defeat. The general moved away from the holographic display, pacing across his quarters as he struggled to find words for what his forces had encountered. But even that was only the beginning. As news of the attacks spread across the planet, something extraordinary began to happen. The distinction between military and civilian simply ceased to exist. Farmers became sappers. Teachers became snipers. Children became scouts and messengers. Elderly citizens became bomb makers and tactical advisors. Thexarin had witnessed similar phenomena on other worlds, desperate populations forming resistance movements in the face of occupation. But those insurgencies had always followed predictable patterns. They targeted supply lines, avoided direct confrontation, and focused on survival rather than victory. The humans of New Eden had done something unprecedented. They had transformed their entire civilization into a single, unified weapon. Within 12 hours, every human settlement on the planet had gone dark. Not destroyed, evacuated, and fortified. The populations had melted into the wilderness, taking with them every piece of useful equipment and every scrap of knowledge about local terrain. They had turned New Eden into the largest asymmetric warfare training exercise in galactic history, and we were the unwilling participants. The change in human behavior had been so rapid and comprehensive that Thexaren's intelligence officers initially suspected some form of technological mind control. But captured communications revealed the truth. The humans were operating according to pre-established emergency protocols that every citizen apparently understood and accepted. I later learned that human colonies routinely develop what they call contingency plans for exactly this type of scenario. Every civilian receives basic military training. Every settlement maintains hidden weapons caches and supply depots. Every citizen knows their role in the event of invasion. They don't just prepare for war, they prepare to become war. The general stopped pacing, staring out at the stars as he remembered the mounting frustration of his commanders. Standard chronic military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and rapid victory. Their troops were trained to fight conventional battles against organized military units. They had no experience dealing with an enemy that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that struck without warning and vanished without trace. By the second day, my forces controlled none of the terrain they thought they had secured. Every road was mined. Every building was booby-trapped. Every piece of high ground was under constant observation by human spotters who seemed to materialize from thin air. We couldn't move, couldn't resupply, couldn't establish secure communications without coming under attack. The most disturbing reports had come from his psychological warfare specialists, who had attempted to break human morale through standard intimidation tactics. Captured civilians were supposed to provide intelligence about resistance activities and convince their fellow humans to surrender. Our interrogation techniques, which had proven effective against dozens of other species, had no impact whatsoever on human prisoners. They didn't break under questioning. They didn't reveal strategic information. Most unnervingly, they didn't seem to fear death. They appeared to view capture as simply another form of combat, an opportunity to mislead us, waste our resources, and gather intelligence about our operations. Thexaren activated another section of the holographic display, showing the expanding web of human resistance activities across the planet's surface. What had begun as isolated incidents had quickly evolved into a coordinated campaign of unprecedented sophistication. The humans demonstrated capabilities that contradicted everything we knew about their species. They moved through terrain that should have been impassable. They coordinated attacks across vast distances without detectable communication networks. They improvised weapons and tactics faster than our forces could adapt countermeasures. The general's voice grew heavy with something that might have been respect or possibly fear. But, most importantly, they never stopped learning. Every engagement taught them something new about our equipment, our procedures, our weaknesses. They studied us like specimens, cataloged our responses, shared their findings across their entire resistance network. Within days, they were anticipating our moves, countering our strategies, turning our own superior technology against us. As Thexaren prepared to continue his testimony, he reflected on the moment when he had first begun to understand what his forces were truly facing. It hadn't been during a major battle or devastating ambush. It had been during a quiet moment between engagements, when he had received a personal communication from one of the human resistance leaders. The message had been simple, direct, and absolutely chilling in its implications. General Thexaren, we know who you are. We know where you are. We know what you're planning. This is your only warning. Leave our world now, or learn why humans don't fight wars. We become them. At the time, he had dismissed the message as primitive psychological warfare. Now, months later, he understood it had been a promise. The recording device continued its patient documentation as General Thexaren prepared to describe the events that would transform a routine military operation into a nightmare that would haunt the chronic empire for generations to come. The third day of operations on New Eden marked the beginning of what Thexaren would later recognize as his education in human warfare. Up until that point, his forces had been dealing with what seemed like unusually tenacious guerrilla resistance. Annoying, costly, but ultimately manageable with proper tactical adjustments and increased security protocols. Then, the humans showed them what real war looked like. Commander Zeknil was leading a supply convoy through what our reconnaissance teams had identified as a secure corridor. Thexarin explained to his recording device, manipulating the holographic display to show the mountainous region where the incident occurred. Our scouts had swept the area twice. Our aerial surveillance had detected no movement. Our sensors showed no signs of ambush preparation. By every measure, it was a safe route. The general paused, his secondary hands trembling slightly as he remembered the aftermath reports. Even now, months later, the tactical analysis made no sense according to conventional military doctrine. The convoy consisted of 47 vehicles carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Standard protective formation with advanced scouts, flanking security, and rearguard elements. 312 troops total, all veteran soldiers who had participated in successful campaigns against 4 different species. The ambush had begun with what Thexarin's forces initially mistook for a natural avalanche. Massive boulders and debris had crashed down from the mountainsides, blocking the road ahead and behind the convoy. Within seconds, his troops found themselves trapped in a narrow canyon with no obvious escape routes. What happened next demonstrated the fundamental difference between chronic military thinking and human warfare psychology, the general continued. Our troops immediately began standard defensive procedures, establishing perimeters, calling for reinforcements, attempting to clear the obstacles blocking their path. They were following exactly the protocols they had been trained to execute in similar situations. Thexarin activated a series of tactical recordings captured by his forces during the engagement. The images showed chronic soldiers moving with professional efficiency, their weapons ready, their formations textbook perfect. They looked competent, disciplined, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The humans waited until our defensive positions were established before revealing their true strategy. The avalanche hadn't been designed to kill my troops. It had been designed to herd them into a predetermined killing zone where every sight line, every piece of cover, every potential escape route had been carefully calculated and prepared. The first indication that the situation was worse than it appeared had come when chronic sensors began detecting movement in areas that should have been completely inaccessible. The canyon walls were too steep for conventional climbing. The terrain was too rough for vehicle movement. The distances were too great for infantry to cover quickly enough to coordinate an effective ambush. I later learned that the humans had spent the previous night moving into position using techniques that defied our understanding of what was physically possible. They had climbed vertical rock faces carrying full combat loads. They had crawled through underground tunnels that they had excavated months earlier as part of their contingency planning. They had established firing positions in locations that our tactical computers had classified as impossible to reach. Thexarin adjusted the display to show the engagement from multiple angles, revealing the true scope of human preparation. Dozens of concealed positions, interconnected by hidden passages and communication tunnels. Supply caches positioned for extended combat. Escape routes that led through terrain the chronic military had dismissed as impassable. When the attack began, my forces found themselves under fire from every direction simultaneously. Not random, undisciplined shooting, but precisely coordinated suppression fire designed to pin specific units in predetermined locations while eliminating key personnel and equipment. The tactical recordings showed the devastating effectiveness of human marksmanship. Chronic officers were targeted first, disrupting command and control. Communications equipment was destroyed with surgical precision. Vehicle engines were disabled with shots that penetrated armor at exact weak points that the humans somehow knew to target. Our intelligence had suggested that human military technology was inferior to our own, that their weapons lacked the range and power to pose a serious threat to properly equipped chronic forces. This assessment was technically accurate and completely meaningless. The humans weren't relying on superior technology. They were relying on superior knowledge of how to use inferior technology to maximum effect. General Thexarin had watched the engagement unfold from his command ship in orbit, initially confident that his trapped forces would break out of the ambush within an hour. Standard chronic doctrine called for aggressive counterattacks, overwhelming firepower, and rapid movement to escape kill zones. Every tactical response my commanders attempted played directly into human hands, he explained, his voice growing heavy with remembered frustration. When our troops tried to establish covering fire, they exposed themselves to human snipers positioned at extreme range. When they attempted to advance up the canyon walls, they triggered carefully placed explosive charges that brought down additional rock slides. When they called for air support, they discovered that the humans had somehow acquired surface-to-air missiles. The mystery of human equipment had puzzled chronic intelligence throughout the early phases of the invasion. Reconnaissance reports consistently indicated primitive agricultural technology and basic defensive weapons. Yet human fighters were demonstrating access to military hardware that should have been far beyond their technological capabilities. I finally understood the source of their equipment when one of my aerial reconnaissance drones captured images of human workshops hidden throughout the mountain regions, Thexarin said, activating a new series of recordings. They weren't importing advanced weapons. They were manufacturing them from raw materials using knowledge and techniques that our scientists insisted were impossible for their level of technological development. The workshops revealed the true scope of human preparation for invasion scenarios. Civilians with backgrounds in engineering, chemistry, and manufacturing had collaborated to create an underground industrial network capable of producing everything from explosives to electronic warfare equipment. Farmers had become metallurgists. Teachers had become weapons designers. Children had become assembly line workers in hidden factories. The humans had transformed their entire civilization into a military-industrial complex without abandoning their civilian identities or occupations. They maintained their agricultural production, their educational systems, their social structures, while simultaneously preparing for total war. They had achieved something that chronic military theorists had always assumed was impossible. They had militarized their society without militarizing their culture. The engagement in the canyon had lasted 14 hours. By the time reinforcements arrived, 38 chronic vehicles had been destroyed, 247 troops were dead or wounded, and the humans had vanished as completely as if they had never been there. The most disturbing aspect of the ambush wasn't the casualties or the equipment losses, Thexarin explained. It was the realization that the humans had allowed us to rescue the survivors. They could have eliminated my entire convoy if they had chosen to do so. Instead, they had demonstrated their capabilities, gathered intelligence about our equipment and tactics, and withdrawn with minimal losses to their own forces. The general paused his recording, walking to the viewport to stare out at the stars as he remembered the growing sense of unease among his officer corps. The humans weren't fighting to win individual battles. They were fighting to learn, to adapt, to transform every engagement into a laboratory for improving their techniques. Over the following days, similar incidents occurred across the planet. My forces would advance into areas that appeared undefended, only to discover that the humans had turned entire regions into elaborate testing grounds for asymmetric warfare tactics. Every engagement taught them something new about our capabilities. Every encounter gave them opportunities to experiment with new weapons and techniques. Thexarin returned to his recording station, activating additional tactical displays that showed the expanding network of human resistance activities. What had begun as isolated incidents was evolving into something unprecedented in galactic military history. By the end of the first week, my intelligence officers reported that human fighters were sharing tactical information across the entire planet in real time. They had established communication networks that our electronic warfare specialists couldn't detect, coordinate, or disrupt. They were operating as a single, unified organism with 50,000 individual components, each capable of independent action while maintaining perfect coordination with the whole. The transformation of human resistance from amateur guerrilla activities to professional military operations had occurred with shocking speed. Within days, civilian fighters were demonstrating tactical sophistication that rivaled elite chronic special forces units. They were anticipating enemy movements, coordinating complex operations, and adapting to changing battlefield conditions faster than trained military officers. I began to suspect that our intelligence assessments about human psychology were fundamentally flawed, the general continued. We had assumed that human civilians would react to invasion like the civilian populations of other species, with panic, confusion, and eventual submission. We failed to understand that humans don't have civilian populations in the same sense that other species do. They have sleeping military populations that activate instantly when threatened. The most chilling discovery had come when chronic psychologists attempted to analyze captured human communications. Instead of finding evidence of fear, desperation, or despair, they found detailed discussions of tactical improvements, equipment modifications, and strategic planning. The humans weren't fighting for survival, they were fighting for victory. The communications we intercepted revealed that human resistance fighters were treating the invasion as an educational opportunity. They were studying our equipment, analyzing our tactics, documenting our psychological responses to different types of resistance activities. They were learning from us faster than we were learning from them. Thexarin activated a recording of one captured human transmission that had particularly disturbed his intelligence staff. A group of civilian engineers were discussing modifications to improvised explosive devices based on observations of chronic armor vulnerabilities. Their tone was conversational, almost academic, as they shared technical specifications and tactical recommendations. These weren't trained soldiers discussing military operations, the general explained. These were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who had somehow acquired expert-level knowledge of military engineering within days of the invasion beginning. They were innovating faster than our weapons development teams could respond. The recording continued with human voices calmly discussing the psychological impact of different ambush techniques on chronic morale, the optimal timing for surprise attacks, and strategies for maximizing enemy resource expenditure while minimizing their own casualties. They spoke about warfare with the detached professionalism of military analysts conducting post-battle assessments. I realized that we weren't fighting an insurgency or a resistance movement. We were fighting an entire civilization that had instantly transformed itself into a single, highly sophisticated military unit. Every human on the planet had become a soldier, a strategist, and a weapon simultaneously. As General Thexarin prepared to describe the events of the second week of operations, he reflected on the moment when he had first begun to understand that his forces weren't engaged in a military campaign. They were participating in humanity's graduate-level course in advanced warfare techniques, and the Chronic Empire was providing the curriculum through their own defeat. The second week of operations on New Eden began with what Thexarin had hoped would be a decisive show of force. His orbital bombardment specialists had identified what appeared to be a major human stronghold in the planet's northern continent, a network of facilities that intelligence suggested served as the coordination center for resistance activities across the entire world. I ordered a concentrated bombardment of the target zone using our most advanced kinetic weapons, the general explained to his recording device, his voice heavy with the memory of that decision. The strike package included enough firepower to level a major city. Our tactical computers calculated a 97% probability of eliminating all resistance leadership and breaking the humans' coordination capabilities. The bombardment had proceeded flawlessly from a technical standpoint. Massive tungsten rods had streaked down from orbit, striking their targets with the force of nuclear weapons. The entire region had been reduced to a landscape of craters and twisted metal within minutes. Reconnaissance drones confirmed complete destruction of all structures in the target area. For 12 hours, human resistance activities across the planet appeared to cease completely. Thexarin continued. Our communications interceptors detected no enemy transmissions. Our surveillance networks observed no movement in areas where human fighters had been active. My staff began preparing reports claiming a decisive victory. The general paused, manipulating his holographic display to show the bombardment site and the surrounding regions. Even now, months later, the tactical analysis raised questions that chronic military doctrine couldn't answer. Then, we received a communication from someone identifying himself as Colonel Marcus Chun, operational commander of New Eden Defense Forces. The transmission came from the exact coordinates we had just bombarded, coordinates where our sensors indicated nothing could possibly survive. The message had been brief and delivered in perfectly accented chronic military language, suggesting that the human leadership possessed linguistic capabilities that intelligence reports had never mentioned. Colonel Chin thanked us for providing what he called an excellent demonstration of chronic orbital bombardment capabilities and invited us to observe how humans responded to similar tactics. He then proceeded to provide technical specifications for our bombardment systems that were more accurate than some of our own engineering manuals. Thexarin had initially assumed the transmission was some form of electronic warfare deception, possibly using pre-recorded messages to create the illusion of survival. Human technology wasn't supposed to be sophisticated enough for such operations, but the entire invasion had revealed gaps between intelligence assessments and battlefield reality. The truth became apparent when our reconnaissance teams investigating the bombardment site discovered that the facilities we had destroyed had been carefully constructed decoys. Perfect replicas of human command centers, complete with fake equipment, simulated communications traffic, and even artificial heat signatures designed to fool our targeting systems. The real human command facilities had been located several kilometers away, hidden beneath natural terrain features, and shielded by technological countermeasures that chronic science insisted should have been impossible for humans to develop. Colonel Chin's second transmission explained that human forces had been monitoring our orbital surveillance patterns for weeks, analyzing our targeting procedures, and constructing the decoy facility specifically to test our bombardment capabilities under controlled conditions. They had turned our most devastating weapon into a training exercise. The implications of human deception capabilities had sent shock waves through Thexarin's intelligence staff. If the humans could fool chronic targeting systems, monitor orbital surveillance networks, and predict military operations with such accuracy, then every assumption about their technological limitations needed to be reconsidered. Over the following days, it became clear that the humans had been conducting similar deception operations throughout the first week of the invasion. Many of the resistance activities we thought we were observing had actually been carefully orchestrated performances designed to mislead us about human capabilities, intentions, and strategic priorities. The general activated a series of tactical recordings that showed various human operations from the early days of the invasion. Viewed with the benefit of hindsight, patterns emerged that his analysts had completely missed during real-time assessment. Human fighters had been deliberately exposing certain capabilities while concealing others, allowing us to develop countermeasures against weapons and tactics they had no intention of using in serious engagements. They had been teaching us to fight the war they wanted us to fight, not the war they were actually planning to fight. The most disturbing discovery had come when chronic cryptographers finally succeeded in breaking what they thought was a human communication code. Instead of tactical intelligence, they found detailed psychological profiles of chronic military personnel, including accurate predictions of how specific commanders would respond to different types of stress and battlefield conditions. The humans had been studying us with the same methodical precision that our xenobiologists used when analyzing primitive species, Thexarin explained. They had identified patterns in chronic military doctrine, psychological weaknesses in our command structure, and technological vulnerabilities in our equipment that we ourselves had never recognized. The breakthrough in understanding human strategy had come when Colonel Chun transmitted a complete breakdown of chronic tactical responses during the Canyon ambush, including analysis of individual officer decision-making processes and recommendations for improving future human operations based on observed enemy behavior patterns. Chun wasn't just commanding resistance forces. He was conducting a comprehensive study of chronic military capabilities using my entire invasion force as experimental subjects. Every engagement had been designed to test different aspects of our training, equipment, and psychological conditioning. Thexarin had demanded a full review of all human intelligence reports, searching for any indication that his forces might be facing trained military strategists rather than desperate civilians. The results had been deeply troubling. Colonel Chin's background, according to our intelligence files, listed him as an agricultural systems coordinator with expertise in crop rotation and soil management. No military training, no combat experience, no advanced education in tactical analysis or strategic planning. The discrepancy between intelligence assessments and battlefield performance had prompted Thexarin to order direct surveillance of several other human resistance leaders. The findings had shattered every assumption about human civilian capabilities. Dr. Sarah Williams, whom our intelligence described as an elementary school teacher, was coordinating electronic warfare operations that our specialists couldn't detect or counter. James Morrison, listed as an equipment repair technician, was designing weapons systems that outperformed standard chronic military hardware. Maria Santos, identified as a local shopkeeper, was running intelligence networks that had infiltrated our own communication systems. The pattern had been consistent across every human resistance leader they investigated. Individuals with no apparent military background were demonstrating expertise that would have required decades of specialized training in any other species. I began to understand that human education and career specialization operated according to principles completely different from other galactic civilizations. When they said someone was a teacher or a farmer or a shopkeeper, they meant that was their primary occupation, not their only capability. Thexarin activated a recording of a captured human training session that had particularly impressed his tactical analysts. A group of apparent civilians were conducting advanced combat exercises with a level of coordination and precision that rivaled elite military units. The humans approached warfare the same way they approached any complex problem, by learning everything possible about all relevant factors, developing comprehensive solutions, and implementing those solutions with methodical efficiency. They didn't distinguish between military and civilian knowledge because they didn't distinguish between military and civilian responsibilities. The recording showed human fighters practicing techniques that combined traditional military tactics with improvisations based on local resources and terrain features. They moved with the fluidity of experienced soldiers while discussing modifications and improvements with the analytical precision of research scientists. What we had interpreted as desperate improvisation was actually systematic innovation. The humans weren't making do with inadequate resources. They were developing superior alternatives to standard military equipment using materials and techniques that our doctrine had never considered. The general paused his testimony, reflecting on the moment when he had finally understood the true nature of his opponent. It hadn't come during a major battle or tactical breakthrough, but during a quiet conversation with a captured human fighter who had explained, with patient courtesy, exactly why chronic forces were losing the war. The prisoner's name was David Kim, a local librarian who had been captured while conducting reconnaissance near one of our forward bases. During interrogation, he politely corrected several inaccuracies in our intelligence reports about human society, provided recommendations for improving our tactical approaches, and offered to help us develop more effective strategies for future conflicts. Kim's casual expertise in military analysis had been matched by his detailed knowledge of chronic psychology, technology, and strategic doctrine. He spoke about galactic warfare with the same calm professionalism he apparently brought to organizing library resources. When I asked him how a librarian had acquired such comprehensive knowledge of military affairs, Kim explained that humans considered such knowledge to be basic civic responsibility. Every citizen was expected to understand the fundamentals of defending their community, just as they were expected to understand basic mathematics or emergency medical procedures. The conversation had continued for several hours, with Kim providing insights into human strategic thinking that were more valuable than months of intelligence analysis. He discussed the invasion from the perspective of someone solving an interesting academic problem, offering suggestions for how chronic forces might improve their effectiveness, while simultaneously explaining why such improvements would be insufficient to achieve victory. Kim's analysis of our campaign revealed that humans had anticipated every major tactical decision we had made and prepared countermeasures for strategies we hadn't even considered implementing yet. They weren't reacting to our actions. They were managing our actions to produce outcomes that served their strategic objectives. The librarian had concluded their conversation by expressing genuine curiosity about chronic educational systems, wondering how a civilization could achieve interstellar travel without developing comprehensive civic defense capabilities among their general population. That conversation made me realize that we weren't fighting a military campaign against human forces. We were participating in a controlled experiment designed to test human defensive capabilities against technologically superior opponents. And the humans were winning that experiment by margins that our military doctrine insisted were impossible. As Thexaron prepared to describe the events that would transform his understanding from academic curiosity to existential terror, he reflected on David Kim's final comment during their conversation. "General, you're fighting this war as if you're trying to defeat us. We're fighting this war as if we're trying to learn everything possible about defeating you. That's why we're going to win." The third week of operations on New Eden marked the beginning of what General Thexaron would later recognize as the systematic dismantling of everything he thought he understood about warfare. The humans had finished their analysis of chronic capabilities, completed their weapons testing, and concluded their strategic preparations. Now they were ready to demonstrate what they had learned. The first indication that the nature of the conflict had changed came when my communications officer reported that we were receiving transmission requests from over 40 different human sources simultaneously. Thexaron explained to his recording device. Not random chatter or propaganda broadcasts, but formal military communications following proper diplomatic protocols. The general activated his holographic display, showing the locations of the various transmission sources scattered across New Eden's surface. The pattern was precise, systematic, and deeply unsettling. The humans were conducting coordinated operations on a scale that suggested capabilities far beyond anything his intelligence estimates had projected. Colonel Chin's primary transmission was accompanied by detailed technical specifications for what he described as humanitarian corridors that would allow my forces to evacuate the planet safely. He provided exact coordinates for safe passage routes, schedules for temporary ceasefires, and guarantees of protection for any chronic personnel who chose to leave peacefully. The offer had been delivered with the same professional courtesy that characterized all human communications, but the implications were staggering. The humans weren't requesting negotiations or proposing surrender terms. They were offering to facilitate the withdrawal of an invasion force that still possessed overwhelming technological superiority. Colonel Chin's analysis of our tactical situation was more accurate than our own strategic assessments. The general continued. He correctly identified our supply line vulnerabilities, predicted our likely responses to continued resistance activities, and calculated our maximum sustainable deployment duration down to the day. Thexaron had initially dismissed the human assessment as psychological warfare, but subsequent review by his staff had confirmed the accuracy of Chin's projections in disturbing detail. The colonel explained that human forces had been monitoring our logistical requirements since the invasion began, tracking our resource consumption patterns, and calculating the point at which continued operations would become economically unsustainable for the Chronic Empire. They had been planning our withdrawal before we had even considered the possibility of failure. The systematic nature of human planning extended far beyond tactical considerations. They had analyzed the political implications of the invasion for chronic domestic affairs, estimated the impact on interspecies relations throughout the galaxy, and projected the long-term consequences for galactic military doctrine. Chin's communication included recommendations for how the Chronic High Command could present the withdrawal as a strategic redeployment rather than a military defeat, complete with suggested propaganda narratives and diplomatic talking points. The humans were offering to help us save face while they defeated us. The second transmission had come from Dr. Sarah Williams, the elementary school teacher who had been conducting electronic warfare operations that chronic specialists still couldn't fully understand. Her message focused on what she termed educational opportunities arising from the conflict. Dr. Williams explained that human forces had been documenting every aspect of our military operations with the intention of sharing their findings with other species who might face similar invasions. She offered to provide copies of their analysis to our military academies, suggesting that future chronic officers might benefit from studying human defensive innovations. The teacher's tone had been genuinely enthusiastic, as if she were discussing a particularly successful classroom project rather than the systematic neutralization of a superior military force. Williams had prepared what she called a curriculum package that included detailed breakdowns of successful human tactics, analysis of chronic psychological responses to asymmetric warfare, and recommendations for how other species might adapt human techniques to their own defensive needs. She was treating our invasion as a teaching moment for the entire galaxy. The third transmission had been the most unsettling. James Morrison, The equipment repair technician who had been designing advanced weapons systems had contacted Thexarin's engineering teams directly to discuss technical improvements to chronic military equipment. Morrison's analysis of our weapons and vehicles identified dozens of design flaws and operational inefficiencies that our own engineers had never noticed. He offered to share human innovations that could improve chronic military effectiveness by significant margins, explaining that stronger opponents would provide better learning opportunities for future human defenders. The repair technician had approached military engineering with the same problem-solving methodology he apparently applied to broken farming equipment, treating chronic technological superiority as an interesting challenge rather than an insurmountable obstacle. Morrison explained that human engineers had been reverse engineering our equipment since the invasion began, not to copy our designs, but to understand their limitations and develop countermeasures. He showed us weaknesses in our most advanced systems that we had classified as impossible to exploit. The pattern of human communications revealed a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet their tactical assessments continued to prove accurate, while their strategic predictions unfolded exactly as projected. By the fourth day of the third week, it became clear that the humans weren't just offering safe passage for my forces, they were demanding it. Not through threats or ultimatums, but through the systematic demonstration that they could destroy us whenever they chose to do so. The demonstration had begun with the simultaneous neutralization of all chronic forward observation posts across the planet, not through direct assault or bombardment, but through techniques that left the installations intact while rendering them completely useless for surveillance or communication. Human infiltration specialists had somehow accessed our most secure facilities without triggering any detection systems, modified our equipment to feed false information to our tactical networks, and withdrawn without leaving any evidence of their presence. We were receiving perfectly formatted intelligence reports about human activities that were completely fabricated. Thexarin's intelligence officers had spent days trying to understand how humans had penetrated security systems designed to be impervious to infiltration by less technologically advanced species. The breakthrough came when one of our technical specialists discovered that the humans hadn't needed to overcome our security measures. They had convinced our own systems to grant them access by providing authentication codes and clearance protocols that our computers couldn't distinguish from legitimate chronic credentials. The level of technical sophistication required for such an operation suggested that human understanding of chronic technology exceeded that of many chronic engineers. They had achieved complete penetration of military networks using knowledge they shouldn't have possessed and techniques they shouldn't have been able to execute. Colonel Chin's explanation of their infiltration methods revealed that human forces had been monitoring our communications since the day we arrived in the system. They had analyzed our protocols, studied our security procedures, and learned to operate our equipment better than our own technicians. The systematic compromise of chronic tactical systems had been followed by a demonstration that left no doubt about human intentions. Every piece of military hardware that his forces had brought to New Eden simply stopped working. Not destroyed, not damaged, not captured, disabled through methods that our engineers couldn't detect or reverse. Vehicles wouldn't start. Weapons wouldn't fire. Communication systems wouldn't transmit. Life support systems continued functioning normally, but every piece of equipment designed for combat operations became completely inert. The technical analysis of the shutdown had revealed the true scope of human preparation for the invasion. They had identified vulnerabilities in every major system, developed countermeasures for every type of equipment, and implemented coordinated electronic warfare techniques that neutralized an entire military force without causing a single casualty. Dr. Williams contacted us again during the shutdown to explain that human forces had developed what she called non-lethal pacification protocols specifically for this conflict. She apologized for any inconvenience and offered technical support to help us restore our equipment once we left the planet. The elementary school teacher had provided detailed instructions for reversing the shutdown procedures, along with recommendations for upgrading chronic security systems to prevent similar vulnerabilities in future conflicts. The humans had demonstrated that they could eliminate us whenever they chose, but they preferred to simply make it impossible for us to continue fighting. They treated our invasion force like misbehaving children who needed to be gently, but firmly sent home. General Thex Aaron paused his recording, staring at the tactical displays that showed the final positions of his forces on New Eden. Thousands of elite soldiers sitting in disabled vehicles, carrying non-functional weapons, surrounded by humans who could have killed them all but had chosen simply to make them irrelevant. The final communication from Colonel Chun included detailed arrangements for our evacuation, complete transportation schedules, and even provisions for medical care for any troops who had been injured during the conflict. The humans were organizing our retreat with the same methodical efficiency they had brought to defeating us. The colonel had also included what he called a graduation certificate, acknowledging chronic participation in what he termed Advanced Asymmetric Warfare Training Exercise New Eden 1. He thanked Thex Aaron's forces for their contribution to human defensive education and invited them to participate in future training scenarios if they were interested in improving their tactical capabilities. Chin's final message explained that the humans had never intended to destroy us. They had been testing their defensive theories against a technologically superior opponent while developing techniques that other species could use to defend themselves against similar invasions. We had been participants in the largest military education experiment in galactic history, and we had served as both the teachers and the curriculum. The general reflected on the moment when he had finally understood what David Kim, the librarian, had tried to tell him during their conversation. The humans weren't fighting a war, they were solving a problem, and the solution they had developed would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. As my forces prepared for evacuation, I realized that the Chronic Empire had just provided every species in the galaxy with a comprehensive guide to defeating technologically superior invaders. The humans would share their innovations freely, turning our military advantages into historical curiosities within a generation. The true scope of human strategy extended far beyond the defense of a single colony. They had used the invasion of New Eden to develop techniques that would make conquest impossible throughout the galaxy, turning superior technology from an overwhelming advantage into a liability that could be systematically neutralized by properly prepared defenders. We came to New Eden to demonstrate chronic military superiority and convince humans to submit to our authority. Instead, we provided humanity with everything they needed to make submission irrelevant for any species smart enough to learn from their example. 6 months after the evacuation from New Eden, General Thex Aaron sat in his private chambers aboard a transport ship heading toward the Galactic Military Tribunal, preparing to deliver testimony that would end his career and possibly his freedom. The Chronic High Command had made it clear that certain truths were too dangerous to acknowledge publicly, but the general could no longer remain silent about what his forces had encountered on that distant agricultural world. The final week on New Eden revealed the true magnitude of what the humans had accomplished. He explained to his recording device, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that his superiors refused to accept. They hadn't just defeated a superior military force. They had created a template for defending any world against any conceivable invasion. The evacuation had proceeded with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all human operations. They had provided transportation for injured chronic personnel, technical support for repairing essential systems, and even psychological counseling for troops suffering from what human medics diagnosed as tactical disorientation syndrome. Dr. Williams personally supervised the medical care for my wounded soldiers, explaining that human defensive protocols included provisions for enemy casualties because, as she put it, suffering serves no strategic purpose once the conflict is resolved. She treated our injuries with the same professional attention she presumably gave to children in her classroom. The elementary school teacher had also provided Thex Aaron with a comprehensive report analyzing chronic psychological responses to asymmetric warfare, complete with recommendations for improving military training programs and suggestions for reducing trauma among troops who might encounter similar situations in future conflicts. Williams apologized for any distress our forces had experienced during the conflict, explaining that human defenders had tried to minimize psychological damage while achieving their tactical objectives. She offered to collaborate with chronic medical specialists to develop better treatment protocols for what she termed technological superiority adjustment syndrome. The general paused his testimony, reflecting on the casual kindness with which the humans had treated their defeated enemies. They had shown more concern for chronic welfare during the evacuation than the High Command had demonstrated during the planning phases of the invasion. Colonel Chin's final briefing included detailed analysis of every engagement throughout the conflict, identifying mistakes our forces had made and suggesting improvements for future operations. He treated our military education as seriously as he apparently treated everything else, providing recommendations that would have made us more effective opponents if we had encountered them earlier. The colonel had also shared intelligence about other human colonies throughout the galaxy, explaining their defensive preparations and offering to coordinate joint training exercises with any species interested in learning asymmetric warfare techniques. Chen explained that New Eden had served as a testing ground for defensive innovations that would be implemented throughout human space within months. Every colony was receiving detailed reports about our tactical capabilities, our equipment vulnerabilities, and our psychological responses to different types of resistance activities. The systematic documentation of chronic military characteristics meant that any future conflict with humanity would begin with humans possessing comprehensive knowledge of their opponent's strengths, weaknesses, and likely tactical decisions. More disturbing was Chen's casual mention that similar analysis was being conducted on every major galactic military force. Human intelligence networks had apparently been studying potential opponents for decades, developing countermeasures for weapons and tactics they had never faced but might encounter someday. The scope of human preparation extended far beyond defensive planning. They had created an intelligence analysis system that treated every other species as a potential case study in military effectiveness, documenting capabilities and developing countermeasures as a matter of routine strategic planning. James Morrison's technical briefings revealed that human engineers had been reverse engineering equipment from dozens of different species, not through espionage or theft, but through careful analysis of publicly available information about technological capabilities and design philosophies. The repair technician had explained that humans approached military technology the same way they approached any engineering challenge, by understanding fundamental principles, identifying potential improvements, and developing innovative solutions using available resources. Morrison offered to share human innovations with our engineering teams, explaining that technological advancement served everyone's interests as long as it was used for defensive rather than aggressive purposes. He provided technical specifications for improvements to our life support systems, communication networks, and even recreational facilities. The human willingness to share technological advances with former enemies reflected a strategic philosophy that Thexarans still struggled to understand. They appeared to believe that making other species more capable would somehow serve human interests. David Kim, the librarian who had provided such valuable insights during his capture, contacted me personally during the evacuation to offer his services as a consultant for improving chronic military education programs. He suggested that our forces would benefit from studying human approaches to problem-solving and strategic analysis. Kim had prepared a comprehensive curriculum that could be adapted for chronic military academies, complete with case studies, practical exercises, and assessment protocols. He offered to teach classes himself if chronic educational authorities were interested in learning alternative approaches to tactical training. The librarian's educational proposals revealed that humans viewed the entire conflict as a learning opportunity for everyone involved. They had gained valuable experience in defending against technologically superior opponents, while we had received instruction in advanced warfare techniques that our doctrine had never considered. The systematic nature of human educational thinking extended to every aspect of the conflict. They had documented lessons learned, developed training materials, and created instructional programs that could be shared with any species interested in improving their defensive capabilities. As my forces prepared for final departure, Colonel Chen presented me with what he called a graduation portfolio, comprehensive documentation of everything our forces had accomplished during the conflict, analyzed from both chronic and human perspectives. The portfolio included tactical assessments that were more detailed than anything Thexaran's own staff had produced, strategic analyses that revealed patterns his commanders had completely missed, and psychological evaluations that demonstrated profound understanding of chronic military culture. Chin's analysis identified numerous areas where our forces had performed exceptionally well, strategies that had posed significant challenges for human defenders, and innovations that had surprised even their most experienced tactical analysts. He praised our adaptability, our professional discipline, and our commitment to minimizing civilian casualties. The colonel had also included recommendations for how chronic forces could apply lessons learned from the New Eden experience to future conflicts, whether against humans or other opponents. The final section of the portfolio contains something that still disturbs me months later: detailed projections of how the conflict might have proceeded if human forces had chosen to prioritize military victory over educational objectives. Chin's analysis suggested that our evacuation could have been replaced with annihilation if the humans had simply decided that learning was less important than winning. The theoretical analysis included timeline projections, casualty estimates, and resource requirements for completely eliminating chronic forces using techniques the humans had developed but chosen not to implement. Chin explained that human defensive doctrine prioritized education over elimination because, as he put it, dead enemies can't learn better ways to solve problems peacefully. He hoped that our experience on New Eden would encourage the Chronic Empire to reconsider its expansion policies and explore alternative approaches to interspecies relations. The general paused his recording, staring at the graduation portfolio that still sat on his desk. The document represented everything that was wrong with current chronic strategic thinking and everything that was terrifying about human defensive capabilities. The final communication from New Eden came 3 days after our departure. Every human colony in the galaxy simultaneously transmitted detailed technical specifications for the defensive innovations they had developed during our invasion. They were sharing the tools necessary to defeat any technologically superior opponent with every species that might someday face a similar threat. The systematic distribution of military knowledge meant that the advantages the Chronic Empire had enjoyed for generations would become meaningless within months. Any species with the intelligence to implement human techniques would become effectively unconquerable. But the most disturbing aspect of the human data distribution wasn't the military information, it was the educational materials. They had created instructional programs that could teach any species to think like humans, to approach warfare as a problem-solving exercise rather than a dominance competition. Thexarin realized that humanity had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had taken the knowledge necessary to defend against conquest and made it freely available to everyone, transforming military advantage from a permanent condition into a temporary inconvenience. As I prepare to testify before the tribunal, I understand that the Chronic High Command will dismiss my reports as the fantasies of a defeated general. They will continue planning invasions based on assumptions about human weakness that have been proven catastrophically incorrect. They will ignore warnings about human capabilities because acknowledging the truth would require admitting that our entire military doctrine has become obsolete. The general stood, walking to the viewport to look out at the stars that no longer seemed to represent territories waiting for conquest. Each point of light might now harbor defenders who had learned from the human example, species that had transformed themselves into unconquerable opponents using knowledge freely shared by elementary school teachers and librarians. The humans of New Eden didn't just defend their world, they defended every world. They created a galaxy where conquest is impossible, where technological superiority provides no military advantage, where the only path to expansion lies through cooperation rather than domination. Thexarin returned to his recording device for his final statement, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the end of an era. I have served the Chronic Empire for 30 years, believing that our technological advantages made us the natural rulers of this galaxy. The humans taught me that there are no natural rulers, only species that haven't yet learned to defend themselves properly. Thanks to human generosity, that educational gap is closing rapidly. The general looked directly into the recording device, his expression grave as he delivered his final warning. The age of conquest is ending. The humans have made it clear that any species intelligent enough to deserve expansion into space is intelligent enough to make that expansion impossible through force. We can adapt to this new reality, or we can continue pursuing strategies that will only serve to educate more effective defenders. He paused, thinking of Colonel Chin's final message, delivered with the same patient courtesy that characterized all human communications. General Thexarin, thank you for helping us become better at what we do. We hope you'll use what you learned here to help your people become better at what they do. The galaxy is big enough for everyone, but only if everyone understands that cooperation works better than conquest. The humans didn't defeat us, Thexarin concluded. They educated us. The question now is whether we're intelligent enough to learn from the lesson or arrogant enough to repeat it until there's nothing left to teach. He ended the recording, sealed the transmission package, and prepared to broadcast his testimony to every major news network in chronic space. The High Command could silence one general, but they couldn't silence the truth forever. Somewhere in the galaxy, other species were learning from the human example, preparing defenses that would make conquest impossible and cooperation inevitable. The age of empire was ending. The age of education had begun, and the humans, with their libraries and schools and elementary teachers who moonlighted as military strategists, had become the galaxy's most effective professors in the advanced curriculum of making peace through superior defensive capabilities. General Thexarin had come to New Eden to teach humans about chronic superiority. Instead, humanity had given the entire galaxy a master class in why superiority itself was about to become an obsolete concept. The final lesson was the most important one. In a universe where everyone could defend themselves properly, the only sustainable strategy was to make sure everyone had reasons to want you as a neighbor rather than reasons to want you gone.